On Thanksgiving Day, 1925, Jacksonville's first radio station went on air as WJAX. WJAX followed the unfortunate failure of 3 other Jacksonville radio stations, but this one was different. Opened by the city of Jacksonville, WJAX would stay on air permanently until eventually switching to WFXJ in 2001. WJAX marked the beginning of 100 years of radio broadcasting in Jacksonville, for which we are celebrating today on Thanksgiving Day 2025. Today, I have on Kenneth Thomas and Steve Patrick, both members of the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association. Kenneth Thomas is a current professor here at the University of North Florida, but got his start as a multimedia photojournalist at First Coast News in 1997. Steve Patrick began his career as an assistant editor at WJKS TV until eventually becoming the news operations manager at WJAXT, otherwise known as News4Jax, until eventually retiring in 2021. I am so excited to talk with them today about 100 years of radio broadcasting in Jacksonville.
Do you guys want to start with just introducing yourself and talking a bit about your background?
I'm older. Age before beauty. My name is Steve Patrick. I have been in Jacksonville for 55 years. I graduated from Terry Parker High School, editor of the high school newspaper, which sort of set me on a track for journalism. I had no idea when I started that I would end up in broadcast. I worked for mostly, I worked in through college, actually, as Spinnaker was being founded. I was a little bit involved in that, but not very. I was actually a sociology major and then changed to psychology and was working part-time at the Florida Times-Union. When I graduated, I got a full-time job at a weekly paper. Was in Tampa briefly, back in Jacksonville, and then cable television was originated. And back in the beginning, according to city charter, they had to offer a community engagement, and they allowed the community members to come in and use their facilities to produce television. And some friends and I, some from high school and some not, thought, well, this is kind of neat. So we went in and dabbled with doing television. And we were doing mostly music programming, but I sort of broke out on my own and I very environmentally oriented. I started doing some quasi-documentary videos for the local cable channel, and said, this is better than print, because I was mostly on the photography, graphics, layout side of print. And I realized that when you're holding the camera in television, you have the control of the video, you have control of the sound, and have a large influence on the final product, which typically, if you're working with a reporter in print, your picture is kind of an accessory. I mean, it's nice, it calls attention to the story, but it's not really what people are getting the information from. So I got a tape together and I got hired by Channel 17, WJKS, when they were the ABC/NBC/ABC affiliate. They kept changing. And they were desperate enough because the station was for sale and they couldn't pay much. They hired me. And that started a 40-year career in television. So why I'm telling you all that in a audience that's listening to the history of radio is I got involved in the history of WJKS, WJXT, Channel 4, which started as WMBR, which was the television side of a radio station that was the second radio station ever in Jacksonville, at least the second station that survived. And when I retired, I was on a history committee for the station, and the station sort of moved on, and I got very involved in Jacksonville Broadcasters Association. And last year was the 75th anniversary of WMBR television, which became WJXT. And I put together a program for our organization on the 75th anniversary. which is more than the station did for their own history. Um, and I enjoyed doing that. It was well received. And I was also involved in the website for Jack's Broadcasters. And obviously, if you look at it, it features 100 years ago, 1925 was the founding of broadcasting in Jacksonville when the first radio station went on the air. And so I approached Ken about, well, next fall, it'll be actually 100 years. We need to do something big. And so I worked on it on and off for a few months and intensely for the last few weeks. And then we put this presentation together, which I think you're going to link to.
Yes,
your
yes, I will.
And so I'm not really a native radio person, but I'm interested in broadcasting and the history of broadcasting. And I had the time and interest. And so I probably know as much about the history of Jacksonville radio right now as most people that are alive.
So my name is Ken Thomas. I'm a UNF graduate, just like you will be soon. But when I went to school here, we had a actual broadcasting track, and I did 2 internships. The first internship was at WTLV, Channel 12, and then my internship supervisor there was Dan Hicken. So it's come full circle where he comes back and he's teaching here as well as I am. So then I turned to WJKS in the fall of '87, which was my last semester, and turned that internship into halfway through the internship into a part-time job where I worked with Steve for a long time.
Yeah.
I worked there 9 years, and then
Longer than I did.
and then I went made my way through the broadcasting. I worked at every TV station as a photographer or a sports producer. With the exception of Channel 4, I have not worked at Channel 4. But that's kind of, before I came to UNF to teach, that's kind of my career. How I got involved in the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association is a friend of mine, my chief photographer, Bill Zetterauer. When he retired, he would go to these lunches. And these lunches were at the Mudville Grill. So he invited me to go to lunch one day, so I was able to squeak out of work early one day and go to lunch. And that's where I saw the potential and the need for preserving the history. I saw their vision in my first meeting, and I knew I wanted to get involved. I didn't know how I wanted to get involved, but I knew I wanted to get involved because kind of the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association, while its mission is to preserve the history of broadcasting, the real mission is, and what we're finding out with all these oral histories, is that you're talking to the people who covered the big events in the city, their memories of covering those events. So everything from the Talleyrand oil fire to the Jaguars coming to town, all of that history, without those memories and talking to those members of the media who covered those firsthand, would be erased, would be gone for the next generation and future generations to be unaware of. So that's why I became involved in it. I'm currently serving as the president of the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association and on the board of newly formed Jacksonville Broadcasters Foundation, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But with regards to the radio broadcasting, my only connection to that is going into the different radio stations and covering events or talking to the DJs about things, about stories that we've done. So I don't have a real tight radio broadcasting background, but that's kind of why I asked Steve, and Steve came to me to take the lead with 100 years, because it was more radio related. I know some recent history, 30, 40 years of television broadcasting, but I don't know that much about the radio. But it's still important. Again, our oral history project that we do in conjunction with UNF covers radio and television. So we are continuing that mission, and I think it's a really, really good opportunity for us to capture memories and capture the history.
Mm-hmm. And all of those resources that you guys had mentioned have been utilized by the staff here at the radio station, not just for this event, but some of your interviews archived that you guys have been doing. The one with Professor Angela Spears has been shared quite a bit throughout the office. It's definitely important that you guys have been archiving this. I know all of us, at least people my age and here at the university, have really appreciated it, and I've been kind of sharing it around a bit. I know we briefly mentioned the beginning of some of the history of radio broadcasting. Would you like to do a quick rundown of some of the points?
My presentation, I sort of thought that I would focus on the first quarter century, 1925 to 50. I expanded it a little beyond that because Ken mentioned, anyone who grew up in and around Jacksonville is still around today, thinks of old radio as things from, not necessarily you, Violet, but my generation thinks of the 70s, maybe the 60s. Almost nobody remembers the 50s. If they were around, they were probably little kids. So I wanted to get into at least the era that people remember. So I went from WJAX, which signed on in 1925, and was the only broadcaster. Of course, everything was AM back then. That was the only thing that existed other than amateur and shortwave in terms of wireless broadcasting. But JAX was on the air by itself in Jacksonville for 9 years. It was owned by the city of Jacksonville. Jacksonville decided that other large cities in Florida, even though at that time, 100 years ago, Jacksonville was the largest city by population in the state, and remained that way for 25 or 30 years, because South Florida was a swamp back then. But Miami had a radio station or two, Tampa had two, Jacksonville didn't have any, and so the city put up the money, $10,000, to build a studio in a converted city building right near Springfield on Main Street, near where FSCJ downtown campus is today. And they built a great studio, hired an engineer out of Washington, D.C. to build it for them, and it was a great success. They didn't need to sell advertising because it was city-owned. They didn't really, they could just afford to rent it with city money. But they did also make revenue because they affiliated with the NBC radio network, so they got affiliate fees. So they actually made a profit. They made $1 million total over the first 15 years, which back then was pretty good money. So 9 years later, WMBR, which actually had bounced around, it was licensed in Miami, then went on the air in Tampa, had too much competition because there were two other stations. In today's world, that seems like heaven. But they decided to move to Jacksonville, where the only competition was basically a non-commercial station, city-owned. So MBR signed on 9 years later, and then because radios caught on, they started being the sets got cheaper to put in your house. They started putting them in cars, radio receivers. So over the 40s and 50s, more and more stations signed on. So by the late 40s, there were 5 radio stations in town. But then I actually extended the review that we did for our organization into the 50s, so I could include WOKV, which is still on the air as one of the dominant country radio stations in Jacksonville, although it's all FM now, and WAPE, which is the same. It went on the air as a top 40 and moving toward rock and roll when they first signed on in 56, I believe it was, or 58. And they are still on the air, obviously on FM. Not quite the jock radio that they were, that early people remember with the Grease Man and others, but they're still on the air doing album-oriented rock, which is sort of playing the music of the 60s and 70s and 80s. So that was my thumbnail history of the first 7 stations assigned on in Jacksonville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know I'll briefly touch on some of the history of, Spinnaker Radio, since most of our listeners are through that. Originally, Spinnaker had just been like a student club on campus that was formed in around 1993 by student Todd Harding. And we didn't officially join as a broadcasted radio station until around the... I think we officially became we had a UNF Broadcasters Association around 2006, maybe 7, I believe. And then officially we became a part of the Spinnaker branding in 2013. And now we are no longer on FM, starting actually last month officially. We are officially off air, but fully digital. And I was talking about this with you guys before we officially started recording, about how a lot of us here at the station felt that it was important to start discussing some of the history of Jacksonville broadcasting, especially now that we are not on FM and we are fully digital, to keep that importance and also keep that history alive, especially with, most people who are listening to this will not know the history of Jacksonville broadcasting. I've only met maybe 5 or 6 people even at UNF that still listen to the radio, which is why we have such a push to try to get students and people my age to start listening to this and remember, even if you don't listen to the radio, but understand the importance and the history that came from news and TV broadcasting. And like you said earlier, firsthand experiences of these major news events that people remember or want to learn more about, and archiving, and that archival process being very important, especially to the university too, for student studies and things.
It definitely is. I think being able to take a look back at where you came from is not only helpful to the newbies, if you will. It's very helpful to keep, I want to say memories, but keep in mind kind of where we were. Steve and I were both working in broadcasting when the Jaguars almost weren't a thing. There was a big push, and then all of a sudden they pulled out. And that was a big, big story. So being able to understand that here we are 30 years later, almost 31 years later, and understanding that the Jaguars, while they were awarded a franchise, they almost didn't become a franchise in Jacksonville. They were, I think Wayne Weaver, if I'm not mistaken, pulled his financial backing out and was going to go somewhere else, was just going to take it somewhere else. And it took the community, the fact of what the community did by buying 10,000, I think it was 10,000 seat tickets,
the seat licenses.
The seat licenses to keep the team here. If that wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't have the Jaguars. And it's those kind of stories that I think are important to remember. And that's why we do the oral histories. It's firsthand knowledge of that actually happening. We were right there, literally at the table when Wayne Weaver had a press conference and said, "We're done." And then it took 4 or 5 days, and he got back to the table. A lot of community support. Tom Petway and everybody came in and did things that made him calm down and reinvest in our community. And without that, like I said, without that story, people just think the Jaguars, have always been here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just one example of what has happened, and that we try to preserve those histories. You just informed me of Spinnaker's history. I went here, I graduated in 1987. We didn't have anything, I didn't know that it started out as a club. I had no idea, and I've been teaching at UNF for 10 years, and I've been on the Spinnaker board for 10 years. I didn't know it. So it's those little pieces of information that are helpful to be able to communicate to the community so they understand where things were and how we got here.
And to pick up on that, that's what broadcasting is. Especially, I mean, Ken and I both come from the news side, but it's a reflection on the community. We're gathering the information and telling people what we think they should know and to become informed voters or consumers of whether it's products or sports entertainment. And those, like hurricanes and elections are a recurring thing that broadcast media has always covered. And that's one of the things that is covered in the oral histories that we talk about a lot with some of the people. And one of the advantages that we have is some of the oral histories are with people that have some name recognition. So there's a lot of good information from I think we're up to 42 or whatever, and we're recording 3 or 4 more every year. But at least a dozen of them are names that people that aren't necessarily big media fans, they've probably heard of. It's George Witterling and Arthur Crofton, and Robbie Rose is about to go up. Yeah. And you can throw out a couple other names, but these people have been sort of in your home because you were listening to the radio or watching television, and you relied on these people for news, information, or entertainment. And so you might want to give up 45 minutes or 30 minutes of your time to hear their origin story and how they got to Jacksonville and how they were influenced by this place. So many of them came here and stayed, which is an unusual thing in broadcasting, because the typical pattern is you move around, you go to a bigger city to get a better job and more money. Jacksonville, I think, is a little bit of a anomaly in that regard, because a lot of these people came here and stayed and retired in Jacksonville. And for the radio television connection, a lot of TV people started in radio. And several of those people, like Glenn Fisher is one example, started in radio. A lot of David Luckin started radio. So they're broadcasters at heart, trying to reach an audience and convey information and connect with people. And so it's great that most of these people could do it by staying in Jacksonville, growing with the city and with the media, and that meant they went to television to get a bigger audience. But they have interesting stories to tell about not only themselves, but the history of this place we live in.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen firsthand some of the reactions from the community too. Like I mentioned earlier, working alongside Amma Davis at WEJZ and going to events and things like that, people come up all the time and recognize him just based off his voice. Sure. And they're like, oh my gosh, I grew up listening to you. I remembered this. This was like a fundamental memory I have being in Jacksonville. And one of the things that got me into radio was when I was in high school, I used to work night shifts at a movie theater. And when I was coming home, I'd listen to the Delilah Show. Yeah. And I used to always listen to it. And that was one of the things that when I came to college, I was like, radio seems something. I have a few memories with that. I think I'll, maybe volunteer. And I fell in love with it. And it's something that I love working here. And I love learning and growing and understanding the history, especially in Jacksonville with that. Because radio is a fundamental part of even my generation's life. I mean, I was born in 2005. Like, radio was still a pretty big thing most of my childhood. And especially even while Jacksonville's a bigger city, more rural areas still use radio as some of their main outlet when there's emergencies or hurricanes and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I find that it is important, again, to get these things to people who either want to know more or have no idea about these things. And I'm hoping this podcast especially will go out to people here at the university that are people my age who have no idea of any of this, even people who just moved here for college who don't know Jacksonville's importance and some of the really rich history that came from radio and TV broadcasting.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that for emergency broadcasts, yes, it is a for-profit business. Broadcasting, generally speaking, the stations are for profit. But the other side of the coin is they are a community service. And when you look at getting into broadcasting, or the people who have gotten into broadcasting, the community service is a key component. Being able to tell people stories, being able to warn people during a disaster or bad weather, being able to help them and basically just help them through it. A calming voice over the radio can do that more, be more effective than anything else that goes on, even on TV. If you're on radio, it's kind of a calming presence, if you will. It's easy to fall in love with radio because you can get it just about anywhere. Television, you actually have to have a receiver, at least an old school.
Right. Now you get it all on your phone.
Now you got a streamer, it's all on your phone. But the reality is radio is really quite unique in that appeal to the next generation, to past generations. The history of radio, early history, like Steve was saying, the early history, a lot of people started in radio and then moved to TV.
Well, that's what, the technology. Look at network-wise. There was nothing, if you were an entertainer and you were a broadcaster, you were on radio because that's the only thing that existed until the 40s. So, the Bob Hopes and Bing Crosby's, and not only were they, had records, but they were all had radio shows. Arthur Crawford, not Arthur, who's the Arthur I'm thinking of? Godfrey. Godfrey. They were radio entertainers because that's the only way you reached a national audience. And then in the 40s, 50s, when television took off, they just made the transition over. And it was also interesting talking about old radio is thinking of what, of course, a lot of it is network programming. They had local announcers and they spun records and whatever, but a lot of it was network programming. And if you look at the early radio network programming, it was soap operas. And it was entertainment, it was variety shows. It was the things that we think of as early television, television in our early memories, especially daytime. And that's what they did on radio in the 20s and 30s.
So if you're a history buff and you're interested in how Jacksonville's broadcasting was formed, those oral histories that we have, they're priceless. They really are priceless. They're from people who actually were there, and the best example I can give, although she didn't work in radio that I'm aware of, is Virginia Eder Keys.
Oh, she did.
Did she work in
radio? Her first job was singing on WJAX.
That's just crazy. Virginia Eder Keys, if you look at our oral history, it goes through and there's an interview with her talking about her life and her broadcasting career and how she became basically the first lady of Jacksonville Broadcasting. She was the first woman. So it's things like that we try to preserve, So I think being able to partner with as many broadcasters as we can to get those stories and those memories is beneficial on a number of fronts.
Are you guys worried at all about maybe the newer generation, especially people my age, maybe not caring about these things? Is there a lack of interest or something that you find that archiving these things is in preparation of maybe people not being interested or not wanting to learn about these things? Because one of the jokes we have in the station is like, if anything would have killed radio, it would have been TV. Like we're still here. It's 2025, and while we're not super big, the radio station is still here. But I know a lot of us even here have fears about continuing interest or continuing people even consuming media through radio or broadcast television.
Go ahead, Steve.
there's an old saying in our business that content is king. So the method of delivery has changed and will continue to change. It's changed radically in the last 15 years with everybody having a smartphone. But basically, if you're a good entertainer, you're a good communicator, you will find an audience, and it may be digital only. It's frequently, these days, it is digital only. The bigger, I think, battle is, podcasting is kind of radio. It's just not live. It's not broadcast necessarily, but it's the same format. It's talk radio or it's documentary radio, but it's delivered over your device on demand. And that's the world we live in now. Is everybody wants everything on demand. Yeah. So I worked in television through that transition to where there were more people getting their information from their phone than from our television broadcast, but they were getting it from us. They were getting it from WJXT News for Jax. So the delivery, the challenge to the industry is how to continue to make revenue, because we're an advertising supported business. Now that's one of the battles that the newspapers are having, is because they're getting subscriber fees, and Spotify. I mean, that's radio on delivery, but you're paying a fee for it because you have everything on demand. And if you want to not get it with advertising, you pay a fee for it. That's kind of the battle we're in today, is how are you going to monetize this delivery of content? And there will be a demand for good local content. How it's delivered to people is going to keep changing. And yes, there's some nostalgia and sentimental loss over what radio used to be, and having a large audience of live people all at one time. That's probably not going to come back. But to your point, Violet, the end of my presentation is there are 40 radio stations on the air in Jacksonville. And 5 of your friends listen. I mean, somebody out there is listening. Of course, a lot of it's older people. A lot of people, in their cars that don't have updated technology. That's going to be the easiest way to listen to entertainment or news while you're traveling. But there will always be local content. It's just, how are we going to preserve the memories of how we used to get it, and the splintered audience. And that's true with politics as well as music, as well as news. You don't get a large audience anymore. Everybody has their own niche, their own interest, and they're getting it in their own way. So that's the challenge. It's how to fund it with a increasingly smaller pieces of the pie.
I think that's exactly what you guys are reaching here, is to the point where Spinnaker radio is like, you're not on a FM anymore. You're in that, how do we fund it, how do we change, how do we adapt mode right now? And it's, students are going to have to figure that out, just like general managers and sales managers in the radio stations had to figure it out a couple of years ago. And it's a continuing, I wouldn't say problem, but an issue. Until it's figured out, and that could take decades because it changes so fast. Until it's figured out, the old way probably won't be the best way. It might come back. But your generation, Violet, is not one to consume news on TV, consume news on radio. They want the Spotifys. They want the apps that they can do and just load and buy song by song. We might get to the point, and I said this to my coworker Angela Spears probably 15 years ago. We may get to the point where you're literally getting local stories or national stories, story by story, and you buy them by story. It might get to that point. I don't know, but the changes that we're going through are industry-wide changes, and it is a struggle to keep that for-profit going, that model going. So I don't envy any of you guys or the next leaders from Spinnaker to try to tackle it, because you have to, it's a real issue that you have to face and move forward with.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice to people that might be in my situation, especially and other people here at Spinnaker that are worried about their passion and being able to adapt to this new generation?
So the best advice I can give you goes back to what I talked about with community or what Steve talked about with community content, and the reason that you're getting into the broadcasting industry, whatever you want to define that as. If you are getting in it to make a lot of money, you're not going to make a lot of money.
Only the top 1%.
Only the top 1%.
I'm definitely not in it for the money.
So there has to be that passion. And whatever that passion is, it could be government. You want to report on government, hold people accountable in the government. You want to report on communities. You just want to spin records, if that's, using an old term. If that's what you want to do and that you find enjoyment out of it,
Mm-hmm.
that's what you're going to have to kind of make that choice on. It's not about, and my dad always used to say to me when I was growing up, not about TV, just in general, fatherly advice, is he always used to say basically is, A, don't worry about things you can't control, and B, find a job that you enjoy doing. And he never finished it up with that old cliche of you'll never have to work a day in your life, but it really kind of sort of is. I worked in TV for 30 years, and there's only a very small portion of that time where I did not want to go to work. I wanted to go to work every single day because there was a new challenge, there was a new story to be told. Somebody's story was to be told, and I was the one to be helping tell it. I wasn't the reporter, I was the photographer. So going back to Steve's much earlier comment, controlling what people see and how they feel when they see it, that's the visualization. That's what kept me going. I wanted to be a sports producer since 10th grade, and I did that. I'm an award-winning sports producer, but I'm also an award-winning photographer and an editor. So the reality is you have to do it for what you want to do it for. So my advice to students is always find your passion. And if your passion isn't what you think it was going to be, that's perfectly okay. Just find another passion.
And picking up on that with the job satisfaction is I always felt, and I worked in some situations where I was not happy with management and difficult environment to be in. And there's always a lot of pressure when you're in live broadcasting. But I always felt like my boss was the audience. I'm working for the audience. I'm not working for a paycheck. I'm not working for a man upstairs or a woman. I'm working for the audience. And that's why I wanted to go to work every day. I was actually planning to retire in 2000. And we had a pandemic. And the audience for Channel 4 and News4JAX, which I was doing just the digital platform at that point, went way up because the demand for information, it became very important to people to get the latest information on what the guidelines were, whether we're wearing masks this week or not, but also, where to get toilet paper and what's open and what's closed. Those things became very important to a very large number of our community. And so our need to fulfill that information demand in the community was so high that I actually worked another year because I enjoyed being a part of that delivery of information that people really wanted and needed. And that's not always the case, but there are the times when there's a natural disaster or a big community event, whether it's, getting an NFL franchise or, having a change of leadership or, infrastructure crisis, a bridge is closed or whatever, people seek out local information, the latest credible local information. And that's, I think, why I did it for 45 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as I'm sitting here thinking, I'm thinking of one story. It has nothing to do with natural disaster. It has nothing to do with getting the word out. But one story that Professor Spears and I did was we were the morning show crew. So at 4:30 in the morning, we went to the Bowles High School. Why would we do that? Well, it was in January. It was 27 degrees, and Bowles High School swim team, which has had a lot of Olympians from multiple countries representing not only Jacksonville, but Bowles in the Olympics. That's when their swim team practices. And they were practicing in 27-degree weather, and we were there. And, when I first went there, I was like, these folks are crazy. I mean, I grew up in Michigan, and these folks are crazy. But we were able to tell that story so everybody else in Jacksonville could say, those kids are crazy, And that's what I'm talking about. It's not about money. It's about telling stories, community involvement, and content creation. It's all of that. So, getting back to what you originally asked is, what advice do we have? Like I said, find your passion. If that's what your passion is, the format of what it is, radio, that's going to change. The format of TV's changed. The format of newspapers changed. But does it make you change the way that you want to approach your future career? I don't know if it does or if it doesn't, but that's something that each person has to decide.
And to that point, be flexible. Find the way you do what your passion is in the way that is applicable at that moment. You may have to, and that's kind of common these days, is changing careers a lot, but through it all, there's a through line of what you really are interested in and what you want to do, and you're going to have to find that path, and it's going to change a few times, but you can still find it.
Yeah, definitely. Again, thank you so much, guys, for coming on. I have one more question that's a little more lighthearted at the end. I wanted to know you guys' favorite radio broadcast or radio show that you guys listened to growing up. We have, I've been talking with staff and things like that, and I think even nowadays, we all have like that one radio personality or show that we really enjoyed and kind of got us into it a little bit.
For me, growing up, I grew up in Michigan. I don't remember specific radio people, unless you're talking about sports.
Well, sports counts.
Sports counts, and really, I listen to a lot of Detroit radio because I'm from a little town outside of Flint, Michigan, and while they had radio stations, majority of the ones that we listened to were from Detroit. I don't recall if he had his own show, but I remember listening to Ernie Harwell and Al Kaline doing the baseball games for the Tigers. So they were
I listened to that too, and I was in Indianapolis.
Wow, went that far. That's a long way. It's about 6 hours.
But that's
drive.
the nature of radio back then, because at night, a lot of the stations signed off, and there were these certain channels on the radio that you could pick up 200 and 300 miles away.
So I can't remember his name, but there was one show that I loved. The show was called Pillow Talk, and I know one guy in town who would know what that is, who that person is, and that's Mike Miller, our former president and also JBA member, because he worked in Detroit. Now I'm sure he worked with this guy, but I can't remember his name. But I will say this, for me, I listen to radio on the way to work, around town, in my car. Generally speaking, I have a couple of stereos still at home, so I'll listen to them. once in a while, but for the most part, it's within the car. And I do listen to sports talk radio a lot. So Dan Hicken and Jeff Prosser are kind of, and then Frank Frangie, who I worked with at the time, Gene, as an intern and as a once-a-week employee. And for me, it's just because I personally know the people, and I know how they are, and I know who they are. So that's, I have a little different perspective than most people.
I listened to a lot of radio when I was young, preteen, teenager. It wasn't really for the announcers as much as it was the music. Of course, I grew up in the 60s and early 70s, and there was a lot of great music. But and I was very news-oriented, so I watched television news as a teenager, which is very unusual. So I can't think of a radio personality that I can point out. In terms of now, I am a big PBS fan, or NPR, should we say.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite shows are actually not really news shows. It's This American Life.
That was the one that I was gonna bring up as my that was my mom used to put it on.
And Radio Lab.
Yeah,
Now,
both of those.
If you want something extremely creative use of radio, Radio Lab.
Both of those shows, I actually, again, like I've with this conversation, I'm remembering some of the, like, pinpointing the things in my life that brought me into radio. And when I was in high school, I picked up this graphic novel that was about This American Life and Ira Glass, and it was an interview with them, and it was but that was what got me started with my obsession with Terry Gross. And every time I listened to them every day, all of her interviews, before Brian Thornton passed away this semester, that was who I was writing my biography on, and he had we were trying to get together to try to get her to answer my emails back, because I would send her an email and I was like, please, can you give me an interview?
Well, hopefully she answered you.
Not yet.
Still have
I feel
another week or so.
I'm scared I'm gonna get a cease and desist letter. Too many emails from sending them to her. Again, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about this. This is really important to me, and I from this conversation, it really does feel like it was very important to you guys about keeping this alive and keeping this archived. And I'm really glad that through this that we can share this with students, and hopefully, again, with a new format, like throw it up on our Instagram, and love to show and share some of those archived videos that you guys have going. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Awesome.
Thank you, Violet.